Welcome back to another week of Ramban ala Parsha. This week it's our great zchus to read Parshat Teitze. And just to point out the obvious, which is we're like at ground zero of the chukim u'mishpatim speech that compromises almost all of Sefer Dvarim. And so naturally, there are many mitzvot, ases and los ases in mishpatim, in Teitze. And I thought I would just start with a Ramban. It's very short Ramban, but it's a comment that the Ramban makes many times. I don't think we've seen it yet, and it raises issues with it. So the Torah says, Ki tivne bayit chadash, we're in Perek Chavbet Pasuk Chet, Ki tivne bayit chadash, va'asita ma'akel legagecha, right? You'll make a guardrail if you build a house for the roof or for a porch from which people can fall off. V'lo tasim damim b'veitecha ki yipol hanofel mimenu. And don't put blood in your house. Don't be responsible for somebody's death when the guy falls off your porch. Okay? And the Ramban right here says, V'asita ma'akel legagecha, and this is a theme of the Ramban in Sefer Dvarim, even though I don't think we've seen it yet. Mitzvat ha'ma'akeh mechudeshet o mivoeret. What does the Ramban mean? So he says, a mitzvah mechudeshet is, the Ramban often points out in Dvarim that this is a mitzvah that's new, meaning we think of Mishneh Torah, Dvarim, as being a repeat of the Torah, so the Ramban feels the need to tell us, wait, is this a mitzvah that's come up before or not? So the Ramban says, with respect to the mitzvah of ma'akeh, mitzvah ha'ma'akeh mechudeshet, meaning, it doesn't exist in the Torah beforehand. This is a new mitzvah. And so, okay, we don't have to look for a chiddush in it. We just have to learn it. But then strangely, the Ramban says, O mivoeret, or it also could be seen as a mitzvah that's been mentioned before, mi lo ta'amod al dam re'echa. Because the pasuk says beforehand, lo ta'amod al dam re'echa. And so it could be that the mitzvah of makeh is not this specific requirement of building a guardrail around the mirpeset, around the porch that you have, but it's a requirement to make your home safe, to make sure that there are no places in your home where somebody could hurt themselves, and ultimately, on some level, you would be responsible. Now, this is the Ramban specifically on this pasuk, but the Ramban is hinting at what I believe is a machlokes harishonim between at least the Smak and the Rambam, and a much bigger idea. Right? The idea is there are two mitzvahs in this pasuk. There's an aseh of va'asita ma'akel legagecha, and there's a lo taseh of v'lo tasim damim b'veitecha. So the machlokes in Rishonim is, are those exactly the same? As often you have them, right? There's nothing in between. There's the aseh and there's a lo taseh. They're flip sides of each other. So the Rambam would say the mitzvah of ma'akeh, the Rambam does say, is not specifically building a guardrail, but the mitzvah is, okay, if you have an exposed wire in your house, if you have an outlet that a kid could put his finger in and God forbid get electrocuted, you have a mitzvah saseh to fix that. If you have a swimming pool, you have a mitzvah saseh to put a fence around it because somebody could fall in and drown, right? So that's the Rambam. The Smak thinks otherwise. The Smak thinks that the mitzvah of makeh, for whatever reason, is the mitzvah, right? Building a fence around a porch from which somebody could fall off is the mitzvah saseh. The mitzvah lo saseh v'lo tasim damim b'veitecha is a separate mitzvah, which is that you're supposed to make sure that your house is safe. So if you have a ladder that's rickety and somebody could fall off, or the ladder could collapse, so you either have to fix the ladder or you have to throw it out because that's a danger to people. So it's kind of a question of how you look at it. There's a separate philosophic issue here, which I think is fascinating, which I don't think the Ramban addresses, but certainly the Sefer Achinu does and others, which is, wait, I thought that everything that happens in the world happens because God wants it to happen. So if somebody falls off my roof, isn't it the case that God killed that person and not me? And the Chinuch says, no, it's also to think that way and it's also to lead your life that way. It's true, but we can't be the instrument through which God, punishes a person. Let somebody else be the instrument. I'm not going to be a mitzvah. Yes, God said to Avram Avinu, let somebody else enslave the Jews. I'm not going to enslave the Jews. I'm a good person. I'm a moral person. So says the Chinuch, you do not want to be the instrument through which God's justice is performed in the world. You want to live a life in which you're careful for yourself, you're careful for your family, you're careful for your guests. And that's what the Torah is saying when it says, Va'asita ma'akel legagecha. Okay, last thing is it also represents, just interesting to note, it's not a mitzvah mechuyeves, it's what we would call a mitzvah kiyumit, right? Which is, I am under no obligation to buy a house in which there's a mirpeset and which I can build a ma'akeh. It's not like tefillin, it's not like shofar, it's not like tzitzis, it's not like, well, tzitzis is a bad example, sorry. It's not like matzah, it's not like sukkah, it's not something I have to do. If the circumstances are such, then I can be mekayim this mitzvah, right? I have a house that has a mirpeset that's high up and you could fall off it and it would be dangerous. But it came with a gate around it. It came with a ma'akeh. I didn't take the ma'akeh down so I could be yotzei the mitzvah afterwards. I was zocheh. In Teaneck, as an aside, we built the deck on a slope, and so it required a ma'akeh. And I kept my kids home from school, and we didn't build it ourselves. Italian guys built it. But we put some screws in, whatever, and we made a bracha, a whole different conversation, but all related to the mitzvah of ma'akeh. Okay, now, let's look at a series of mitzvos, because essentially that's what the parsha is, a series of mitzvos that I think revolve around issues of tshuva. We're in Chodesh Elul. They're not specifically tshuva, but they're tshuva related, and I'll show you what I mean. The first one is in Perek Chaf Gimel, Pasuk Yud. Says the Torah, Ki Teitze machana loivecha v'nishmarta mikol davara. It's a strange pasuk, right? When you go to war, v'nishmarta mikol davara. You have to be careful from all bad things. So in what way is the Torah expanding on or clarifying some previous mitzvah? So says the Ramban. Well, first says v'nishmarta mikol davara. So first the Ramban quotes Rashi. Shehasatan mikatreg bishat hasakana lashon Rashi. Right? Rashi says, well, when you go into war, that's a dangerous time. And the Satan might try to get you to sin at that time. So the Torah specifically says, with respect to war, right? V'nishmarta mikol davara, you should be extra careful from sinning, from doing anything wrong. And Rashi, of course, then leads to the discussion in the Ramban. And the Ramban says as follows, V'hanachon be'inai bi'inyan ha-mitzvah hazot. Ki hakatuv yazhir ba'et asher hachet matzui bo. Right? The Torah is warning us, it's not just, for Rashi, it's like, well, if I'm going to war, I'm going to be nervous. And if I'm nervous from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that my life is at risk, I should be frummer, I should be more careful. And that's Rashi's approach. But the Ramban has a broader approach. He says, Ki hakatuv yazhir ba'et asher hachet matzui bo. He says, when you're in a military camp, everybody is immoral. Everybody's doing sins. V'hayadua b'minhagei hamachanot hayotzot lamilchama ki ochlu kol to'eva. He says that everybody knows that in any military camp, they do all kinds of averos. Because like on some level, I was never in a war, but I understand from others, there's some animalistic part of the process. Even the Torah recognizes, right? The idea that you could eat, kasle chaziri when you go to war, right? If you can't get kosher food, you could eat non-kosher food. It relates to this. And he says, when you're soldiers in the army, ki ochlu kol to'eva yigzelu v'yachmesu v'lo yitboshashu, right? Soldiers steal things and they afflict people and they do bad things. Afilu biniyuf, right? They even rape, I suppose. V'chol nivala, and all bad things. So he says, it's not just that you're at a dangerous time in your life because you're at risk. You're at an immoral time in your life, right? All kind of, certainly in other worlds, conquering armies, like rape is part of what they do to the civilians to scare them. It's almost not even even for the Yetzer Hara. V'hayashar bibnei adam bitivo, even if you're an exceptionally moral person by nature, Yitlabesh achzariyut v'chema kitzeit machane al oyev. You're going to become less moral. You're going to become a hateful person. You're going to express all bad midos when you go to war. Va'al kain he's here bo hakatuv v'nishmarta mikol davara. Right, says the Ramban, if I could put words in his mouth. The Torah applies in all times, in all areas. The halachas of the Torah apply. Yes, it's true. There are mitzvot atluyos ba'aretz, but broadly speaking, it applies in all areas. But the Torah goes out of its way to warn you at particularly dangerous times. Not dangerous like Rashi says that I might be hurt. Dangerous like the Ramban says, where I'm not moral. I'm less of a human being than I used to be. Okay, so therefore, the chiddush here is, of course, v'nishmarta mikol davara, it's a davar mevureret. The Torah's warned us before. There's nothing that's going on in this pasuk that's a chiddush. But says the Ramban, the chiddush of the pasuk, if there is one, is that there are times in your life that you need to be extra special careful. And going to war is such a time. Because war by its nature makes people immoral, even though the Torah requires us, and I think certainly in Tzahal, people are moral. And people, don't do things. But it reminds us of the early part of the parsha, which we talked about last year, right? The idea of Eishes Yefas Toar. So the Torah says, Im lo yatirana yisana be'isr. It's almost like the Torah was forced to be matirid. Why? Is that how the Torah works? No, but in war, when people have instincts that overcome them, when people have this sense of not being subject to morality, they can't restrain themselves. Now, as I said with respect to the mitzvah of makeh, God forbid, it's not a mitzvah though, right? Technically it is. It's counted in the Tarek mitzvahs. But it's one of these mitzvahs that presumably, like Gerushin, like Avdul, like Evet Kanani, like Evet Ivri, you don't really want to be Mekayim. When my sons went to the army, I never said to them, it didn't dawn on me to say to them, ooh, this is your chance to be Mekayim the mitzvah of Eishes Yefas Toar. No, of course not. But it does speak to the Torah making a concession, so to speak, to human nature, to the drive to the sex drive at war, to not being careful. And the Ramban finishes here. It's a much longer piece, but we'll just read one more line. Va'al derech hapshat hi azhara mikol hane'asar. Right? The simple pshat is, it's a reminder. Right? The Torah tells us many, many times about Shabbos, many, many times about Avodah Zarah. So the Torah is warning us here to keep the Torah. But the deeper point is that when you go to war, you're at risk. And the Torah is recognizing the fact that even though regular Yisurim are easy for us, for the most part, when you're at war, you have to be v'nishmartem mikol davara. Okay, so let's continue. Now we're up to Yud Gimel Yud Ches. And another strange pasuk. Even though if you read it quickly, it's not strange at all. Lo tihiyeh kidesha mi benot Yisrael, v'lo yeh kadesh mi bnei Yisrael. It sounds like it's a prohibition on being a prostitute, right? And that's kind of how Rashi learns it. Rashi quoted by the Ramban says, "Mikudeshet umizumenet liznut." A kidesha is a woman who's set aside specifically for immorality. V'liyet kadesh mi b'nei Yisrael mizuman lemishkav, and you can't have a guy, a man, also set aside. Presumably, Rashi and the Ramban think this is for homosexual sex. I just think they didn't imagine a person selling himself, a male prostitute being somebody who sleeps with women. Okay, now the Ramban says, V'hinei, im halav hazeh azhara bi'isha hanishkevet, if it's just a regular lo saseh for a woman to sleep with somebody who's not her husband, v'yazhir biyota mikudeshet u'mizumanet liznut, and the Torah is warning her from doing this for a living, im kain, ein hapnuya hanivelet b'mikra ubehatzneya mechayve alavin. Then a single woman who sleeps with somebody in private, she's not doing it publicly, she's not set aside for this kind of activity, it wouldn't be usur, it wouldn't be a lav. In fact, it's not. Right? She's not a prostitute, she's just somebody who happens to sleep with somebody. V'chein, hekadesh lama yazkir bihiyoto kadeshu mizuman. Why would a man be singled out because he's set aside for prostitution? Va'afilu hanival bechadrei chadarim yesh bo karet umitat beis din. This is why I think he thinks it's talking about homosexual sex, because he says that act is an Isser D'Oraisa, is a punishment of Kares and Misas Bezdin. Va'od shehaya ra'ui she'omar lo tiyeh b'chem kidesha v'lo yeh b'chem kadesh ki mi benot Yisrael mi b'nei Yisrael kilu ba'am acher daber. What's the phrase lo tiyeh kidesha mi benot Yisrael? It seems like the Torah is generally speaking about some other nation, and here the Torah has to specifically tell me mi b'nei Yisrael mi benot Yisrael. It doesn't make any sense. And so the Ramban has what I think is an incredible insight, and also a tshuva related or / a responsibility related idea. Says the Ramban, V'hanira be'inai b'lav hazeh, ki hu azhara lebeit din. It's not a prohibition that says you can't be a prostitute. It's a prohibition on Bezdin to say as follows, Shelo yanichu achat mi benot Yisrael Lihiyot yoshevet beparshat drachim be'einayim al hadarach, right? It's telling the Bezdin, you cannot allow a Jewish woman to stand on the crossroads, Einayim badarach, that's the lashon that the Torah used with respect to Tamar and Yehuda, lizima, right, for purposes of prostitution, o shetitaken la kuba shel znut ki minhag artzot zarim, yoshvot ala petach betupim, okay, we'll skip for a second. Says the Ramban, the prohibition is on Bezdin to take responsibility for Klal Yisrael, to take responsibility for the society that Jews live in. And he says, in most societies, it's known, when you want to find a prostitute, you go to 8th Avenue on in the 40s on the west side of Manhattan. Sorry, just my past, right? And that's where you could find them, says the Ramban. No, Bezdin is commanded here to not allow such a situation in Am Yisrael, in Bnei Yisrael, in Benot Yisrael. It's not allowed. It's not that, of course the woman's not allowed to do this. Of course the man's not allowed to do this. But the pasuk of Lo tiyeh kidesha mi Benot Yisrael is a commandment to Bezdin to show responsibility for Klal Yisrael, to not allow a situation where every Jew says, oh yeah, you want to find a prostitute, this is where you go. Now, why should that be usher? So I can only, guess. But my sense is, right, we have Bezdin's a real role amongst Klal Yisrael, and in the absence of Bezdin, our role within Klal Yisrael is to make it a more moral, a more perfect, a society in which people are Oved Hashem. And when we see something that's immoral and is done publicly, we should take action against it. Now, I'm not specifically saying Bizman Hazeh, what you should do and how you should do it. But for a start, you should feel pain to see this, right? To see public desecration of the Torah should bother us. Now, is it practical and does it make sense, and will it actually stop Chilul Shabbos if we throw stones at cars? No, it won't. And there's no benefit to do it. But the idea that it bothers me to see this, it bothers me to know that there's prostitution in the state of Israel in current times. So the Ramban, that should bother us. And again, we have to decide what to do about it. And if we can do something, if we think it would help, then we're obligated to do it because we are the continuation of Bezdin, right? For just like Bezdin is responsible for the moral behavior of Klal Yisrael, and they have to take action to protect the moral behavior of Klal Yisrael, so do we. And so I think here, V'lo tiyeh kidesha mi Benot Yisrael, the Ramban is saying, similar to what he said on the last pasuk, right? Just like war is a shat hasakana, just like war is a time of immorality, when you see immorality in society, the leaders of that society, the Bezdin, has to do something about it. That's how we create a society that's more perfect in its avodat Hashem, and that's how we create a society that's more moral and that we can be proud of. Okay, let's do one more. Oh, let's do two more. Let's do it quickly. On a related theme, the next pasuk says, it's a strange pasuk, but it's a fun pasuk for me anyway. I won't tell you why. The Torah says, Lo tavi esnan zona u'mechir kela beis Hashem Elokecha. Literally, an asnan zona is the sheep with which somebody paid for prostitution. So says the Ramban, that can't be brought as a carbon in the Beis Hashem. In addition to that, lo tavi asnan zon b'chir kela Beis Hashem elokecha lichol neder, as a promised carbon to God. Ki toavat Hashem elokecha gam shneihem. Right? So there are two things. There's asnan zonah, which is the price that a person pays to be with a prostitute, umechir kelev. And let's say you have, like some crazy dangerous dog like Rottweilers or whatever. You can't bring either of them to the Beis Hamikdash. Why not? So says the Ramban, and the Ramban's insight is really, really sharp. Hazonot ya'asu binida shelahem mitzvot. Prostitutes, they're aware that they're doing something immoral. And so therefore they take a portion of their payment and they try to do a mitzvah with it. They bring it to Beis HaMikdash. Choshvot lechaper al chatatan. Right? They think, or they intend, for this to be a kapara. If you're a prostitute, you must live with some sense of guilt. And so therefore, says the Ramban, it's normal for prostitutes to want to give tzedakah. It's often the case that the biggest balei tzedakah, are not often, but often people who are arrested for financial crimes turn out to be supporters of the community and big balei tzedakah. And I think, if you live with a sense of guilt, so then you give more tzedakah, and you want to feel like, okay, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, maybe I did this thing and maybe it wasn't so moral, but look how much tzedakah I'm giving. Alternatively, it could be you have a lot of money because you cheat, and so you give more tzedakah. But either way, says the Ramban, K'mo she'yazkiru rabotenu b'mashal shalahem gaifa b'tapuchaya u'mefalgo levishaya, right? You take apples that you're paid with, and you donate them to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. L'kach asra Torah otanu l'chol neder. You can't make a neder and then pay it off with an asnan zonah. Ki ata yosifu lachato bohen. Now, you could read that line two ways. Ki ata yosifu lachato bohen. It's a sin to do it. Or the way I think, ki ata yosifu lachato, because you don't intend to stop being a prostitute. You're bribing God. It's not real tshuva. Real tshuva is, okay, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, here's all the wages I made from my prostitution, and I'm not going to do it anymore. But offensive to HaKadosh Baruch Hu is, I'm going to keep doing it, but I'm going to give tzedakah on the side to try to assuage my guilt feelings and for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to be better to me. That, says the Ramban, Ki ata yosifu la'achta, you're going to keep sinning. Okay, so that's the first part. That's asnan zonah. What about mechir kelev? So he says, we won't read it inside because we're going to run out of time. Mechir kelev are people, watchmen and otherwise, mean people who keep dangerous dogs, who are dangerous. And so, same thing, says the Ramban, says the Torah. You can't do a bad thing. You can't keep a dangerous dog which scares other people and maybe attacks them and then donate to the Beis HaMikdash, when you get a new dog and you sell the old dog. It's the same idea. Tshuva means changing your ways. Changing ways means I'm not going to do it anymore. And if you plan to do it anymore, that's offensive to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and it's not a mitzvah, it's an aveira. Okay, finally, let's do one last one quickly. It's the one that everybody knows, but I think the Ramban thinks at least that we should be more aware of this. Says the Torah, Zachar eis asher asa Hashem Elokecha leMiriam baderech b'tzeitchem miMitzrayim. Now the context of that pasuk begins two psukim before. He shameh b'nega hatzarat lishmor ma'od v'la'asot kechol asher yiru atchem ha'kohanim ha'levim kashet tzivizim tishmurum la'asot. Right? How do you not get tzaras? By remembering Miriam. Says the Ramban, and this is a fundamental machlokas harishonim. Im basa li zaher shelo tilakeh b'tzarat lo tisaper lashon hara lashon Rashi. Right? Okay, that's a simple pshat in the pasuk. That's something that we all know. But says the Ramban, ulefi da'ati shehi mitzvat asay mamash. Says the Ramban, it's a mitzvah asay to remember that which Miriam did. It's not just, okay, if I want to avoid tzaras, I'll remember Miriam. It's a mitzvah asay. The Ramban, I think, is unique in the Rishonim, in the Monei HaMitzvah, certainly, who counts remembering what the lashon hara of Miriam as a mitzvah asay, but he does. And he says it's just like anything else, right? Zachoris asher asalachem Miriam is just like Zachor Yom HaShabbat Lekadsho, which is a mitzvah saseh. It's just like Zachorit asher asalachem Amalek, which is a mitzvah saseh. It's just like Zachorit Hayom Hazeh asher Yitzatem Mitzrayim, which the Ramban counts as a mitzvah saseh. Right? In almost every siddur after Shachris, you can find the Sheish Zichirot of the Ramban, the 6 things that the Ramban thinks that by remembering, you are Yotze, you are Mekayim a mitzvah saseh. It's really kind of a staggering idea. Zachorit asher salacha Amalek, Kulam mitzvah. Right? The Ramban thinks that each of these is a mitzvah when you do it. Now, you can have a discussion about how often. Everybody knows that Zechiras Amalek is a mitzvah saseh. We do it once a year, right? Everybody knows that Zechiras Yom HaShabbos Lekadsho is a mitzvah saseh. We do it once a week. How often do you have to do the others? I don't know, but the sense is every time you do it, you get a mitzvah. V'hi azhara miledaber lashon hara. Okay, it's also, of course, a warning to speak lashon hara. It's not just a mitzvah to remember it for no reason. Yitzaveh b'mitzvot aseh shenizkar ha'onesh hagadol she'asa Hashem. Right? So he says the mitzvah saseh is to remember the punishment. And here you think there's some unintentional lashon hara about Miriam, and you think maybe the Ramban doesn't respect her so much. On the contrary, he says, She'asa Hashem litzadeket haniviyah. Right? Miriam was a tzadekes, and she was a prophetess. Shelo dibra ela be'achiha. And she also didn't say this publicly about Moshe. She spoke to Aaron. Gemul chasada asher ahavta kinavsha. She loved Moshe Rabbeinu. She risked her life, right? When Moshe was put in the teva and put in the river, Miriam followed it. There was a risk involved in that. She loved her brother. Velo dibra bifanav shibush. She didn't speak in front of him. Velo bifnei rabim. Rak beina levein achia hakadosh bitzina. Aaron HaKohen, the Ramban thinks, was the greatest human being ever. And he was humble, and he was quiet, and he was respectful. These are not people who speak lashon hara. V'chol ma'aseh hatovim lo ho'iluha. And all of Miriam's merits, and she was a tzadekes, didn't help. Gamata im teshev ba'achicha tidaber beven imecha titein dofi lo tinatzel. Says the Ramban, the point to remember is, if Miriam HaNeviah, one of the greatest women who ever lived, was punished for speaking lashon hara about her brother, alachas kama v'kama us. And if she did it in private, and if she did it l'tovato, and she did it all for l'shem shamayim, okay. And the Ramban is emphasizing, and it's really true, that this sin of lashon hara, for which you get saras, is really, really a severe sin. And the Ramban later on, there are different sins, but the Ramban later on says that the idea of saras is compared to murder in the Torah. And he says, when the Torah says, Hishamer b'nega hatzaras, mi nega hatzarat lishmor ma'od shelo tivo'echa v'la'asot ba kechol asher yorucha etchem ha'kohanim v'zachar eit asher asa Hashem akech leMiriam shetehei mazkir zeh befet tamid. It's so important, says the Ramban, that it has to be recalled out loud, tamid. Tamid might mean every day. It might not just be a once a year mitzvah. I think the idea of saying the Sheish Zechiros every day, even Amalek, is probably a mitzvah saseh, and certainly the Ramban thinks so. Umikan nireh sherabotenu ya'asu otam mitzvah lo sipur ve'etza bilvad lihinatzel min hanegaim. It's not just, okay, you want to not get saras, here's how to not get saras. No. Ve'ech yitachen shelashon hara shu shakul kishfichat damim lo tiyeh bo b'Torah lo ta'aseh gamor. How could it be that a sin that's so significant that Chazal compare it to murder doesn't have a particular isser in the Torah? So Ramban thinks this is the isser for lashon hara. The Rambam and other Rishonim think, no, the pasuk of lo telech rachel ba'amecha, which, to be honest with you, sounds much more like it's talking about lashon hara. That's the isser of lashon hara. But here the Ramban makes the point relating to our other points, which is, yes, there are Taryag mitzvos, and there are thousands of Rabbanans. But the fact of the matter is, there are some that are more severe and more important than others. And there are times that are more severe, and there are societies in which we have to do things. And therefore, when you go to war, you have to be more careful. And v'nishmarta mikol davara. And you can't have a society in which there are prostitutes and everybody knows about them. That's lo tiyeh kadesh mi benot Yisrael. And you can't have people who are buying off God by giving karbanot and fulfilling nedarim that are not really planning to be different. Lo tavi etnan zona beit Hashem Elokecha. That's an Issur D'Oraisa. And finally, Miriam, the idea that no matter how many mitzvos and how saintly you are, there are averos that are so bad that you're going to be punished for no matter what. And Miriam HaNeviah HaTzadekes is an example of that. And says the Ramban, therefore, Zachar Eit Asher Asah Elokecha Miriam is in fact a mitzvah saseh. And it's just to say that probably, I don't know if we pass in this way, but the idea of trying to remember it every day, certainly the idea of remembering that it's also to speak Lashon Hara every day can only help us. That's it for today. Yashkach to everybody. Shabbat Shalom. And see you, God willing, next week.